On August 14th, 1803, in the heart of Lime's most prestigious district, the household servants of the Palacios Dieguer mansion discovered something that would shake the foundations of colonial Peruvian society. 4 women, a Marquise, and her 3 daughters, all visibly pregnant, all claiming the same father. What the Spanish crown tried desperately to bury in sealed documents would eventually surface in fragments, revealing a scandal so disturbing that it fractured the delicate social order of an empire already crumbling from within. The man at the center of this catastrophe wasn't a nobleman, a merchant, or even a free citizen. He was property, a slave named Domingo, owned by the very family he would destroy. Before we continue with the story of the Palacios Dieguer household and the secret that consumed it, I need to ask you something important. If you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of colonial history, stories that were deliberately erased from official records, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us what state or country you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these buried truths to light. This wasn't a tale whispered in taverns or embellished by common gossip. This was documented partially in ecclesiastical records, vice-regal correspondence, and family ledgers that survived the deliberate purge of evidence. What follows is the reconstruction of events that the Spanish authorities deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. The year 1803 marked a peculiar moment in Lima's history. The city, once the jewel of Spain's South American empire, had begun showing cracks in its golden facade. Viceroy Gabriel de Ayllus governed from the palace with an increasingly nervous hand, aware that revolution simmered in neighboring territories. The rigid caste system, peninsulares, criollos, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans maintained an artificial peace through centuries of enforced hierarchy. The Palacios Dieguer family occupied the apex of Lime's social pyramid. Maris Catalina de Jura Velasco, widow of the late Mark Fernando Palacios, governed her household with the same iron discipline her husband had once employed. At 43, she remained a formidable presence in colonial society, a woman whose approval or disfavor could make or break reputations among Lima's elite families. Her 3 daughters embodied the refined education expected of their class. Isabella, the eldest at 24, had been promised in marriage to a Spanish count's second son, a union designed to strengthen the family's ties to Madrid. Adriana, 22, demonstrated a sharp intelligence that occasionally troubled her mother, asking questions about estate management and financial matters typically reserved for men. The youngest, Sophia, just 19, possessed a gentle disposition that made her popular in Lima's social gatherings. Though some remarked she seemed distracted, her mind often elsewhere during conversations. The Palacios Dieguer mansion sprawled across nearly an entire block in the San Lazaro district. Its thick adobe walls painted the pale yellow favored by wealthy families. Inside, 47 servants maintained the household's operations: cooks, housekeepers, stable hands, gardeners, and personal attendants. Among them worked 23 enslaved individuals, their labor sustaining the comfort that allowed the family to maintain their social position. Domingo had entered the household 6 years earlier, purchased at auction after the bankruptcy of a sugar plantation outside Trujillo. The ledger recorded him as approximately 30 years of age, in excellent physical condition, literate in Spanish and Portuguese, skilled in carpentry and metalwork, purchased for 850 pesos. This last detail, his literacy, was unusual. Most slaveholders deliberately kept the enslaved illiterate, seeing education as a potential threat to control. The mayors had initially employed Domingo in the stables, but his carpentry skills soon earned him assignments throughout the mansion. He repaired furniture, reinforced doors, maintained the elaborate woodwork that decorated the main halls. His work brought him into proximity with the family in ways that other enslaved workers rarely experienced. Measuring windows in bedchambers, fixing locks on private studies, installing new shelving in the library where Adriana spent her afternoons. Servants later recalled that Domingo spoke little, kept his eyes lowered in the presence of family members, and completed his tasks with meticulous care. The head housekeeper, Senora Vargas, once mentioned to the cook that Domingo seemed different from other workers, too careful, too aware, though she couldn't articulate exactly what she meant by this observation. The household followed rhythms established over decades. Mass at dawn in the family chapel, breakfast in the formal dining room, the mares receiving visitors in the salon, while her daughters attended to needlework, music lessons, or charitable work, supervising the household's production of clothing for the poor. Afternoons brought visiting hours, elaborate meals, evening prayers. The structure seemed unshakable, designed to persist unchanged through generations. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, something had shifted. The servants began noticing small disruptions in routine around March 1803. Isabella, typically punctual for morning prayers, started arriving late, her face pale. Adriana stopped taking her afternoon walks in the garden, instead remaining in her chambers with the shutters drawn. Sophia developed an unusual appetite, requesting strange food combinations that made the kitchen staff exchange worried glances. The mares herself seemed increasingly distracted during her regular meetings with Father Tomas Calderon, the family's confessor. He noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she held her rosary, and her usually precise recitations of prayer occasionally faltered. When he gently inquired about her well-being, she insisted everything remained perfectly normal, though her tone suggested otherwise. By late April, the household's head seamstress approached Senor Vargas with a disturbing observation. All of the mares' dresses required adjustment at the waist, so did Isabella's and Adriana's and Sophia's. The seamstress whispered that the alterations suggested a pattern she'd seen countless times before, the unmistakable expansion of pregnancy. Senora Vargas dismissed the observation as coincidence, perhaps the result of Lemur's unusually prosperous social season leading to overindulgence in rich foods. But the seamstress persisted, pointing out other signs. The way the younger women now avoided tight corsets, the Marquise' sudden aversion to certain foods, the frequency with which all four women retired to their chambers claiming fatigue. This convergence of symptoms across four women of the same household remained medically improbable yet undeniable. And while pregnancy itself wasn't scandalous, widows remarried, daughters found husbands, the absence of any announced engagements, any visiting suitors, any legitimate explanation for these simultaneous conditions created a vacuum that worry and speculation quickly filled. The morning of August 14th began like any other. Dawn light filtered through the mansion's high windows, casting geometric patterns across the tile floors. Servants moved through their established routines, lighting fires in the kitchens, preparing washing water, setting the formal dining room for breakfast. The air carried the familiar sense of baking bread and burning wood. At precisely 6:00, the morning bells summoned the household to chapel for prayers. The servants assembled in their designated area, heads bowed, while the family occupied the ornate front pews. Father Calderon conducted the service, his practiced voice echoing off the painted walls depicting scenes from the lives of saints. But this morning, something was wrong. Only Adriana appeared for prayers. She knelt alone in the family section, her face ghostly pale, hands gripping the pew in front of her with such force that her knuckles showed white. Father Calderon hesitated in his recitation, glancing toward the empty seats where the mares and her other daughters should have been. In 6 years of serving as the family's confessor, this had never happened. Not during illness, not during mourning, not during any circumstance. The priest exchanged looks with Senora Vargas, who stood near the chapel entrance. She gave a small worried shake of her head. She didn't know where the other women were. Father Calderon completed the prayers with unusual haste, dismissed the servants, and immediately approached Adriana. "My child, where is your mother, your sisters?" Adriana's response came in a whisper that barely carried. "You need to see for yourself, Father, in the blue room quickly." The blue room served as the mayor's private sitting chamber, a space where she received only the most trusted visitors and conducted the household's confidential business. Father Calderon hurried through the corridors with Adriana, his cassock swishing against the polished floors. Senora Vargas followed at a discreet distance, her instincts telling her that whatever awaited them would require witnesses. The door to the blue room stood slightly ajar. Father Calderon pushed it open and stopped so abruptly that Adriana nearly collided with his back. Inside, the Marquise sat in her high-backed chair, flanked by Isabella and Sophia. All three women wore loose dressing gowns rather than their usual elaborate morning attire. The August sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated what clothing had previously concealed. Unmistakable swelling in all three women's midsections, the distinctive shape that no amount of fabric manipulation could hide any longer. The priest's hands went to his chest, gripping the crucifix hanging there. "Dear God in heaven, close the door, Father," the mayor said, her voice carrying the command of decades of authority despite her obvious distress. "What we discuss must not reach beyond this room." Senora Vargas, standing in the hallway, caught the priest's eye before he shut the door. He gave her a slight nod. "Stay close, be ready." Then the heavy wood swung closed, leaving the housekeeper in the corridor with her heart hammering and her mind racing through impossible calculations. Inside the blue room, Father Calderon struggled to find words. His training in theology and canon law had prepared him for many human failings: adultery, theft, violence, pride. But this situation exceeded any framework his education provided. 4 women of the same household, visibly pregnant with no husbands, no announced engagements, no legitimate explanation. When he finally managed, "We suspect it began in February," Adriana answered, her voice steady in contrast to her mother's silence. "Different times for each of us, but all within approximately 6 weeks. Who is responsible?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Isabella began crying softly, her shoulders shaking. Sophia stared at her, hands folded in her lap. The mayor's lifted her chin, meeting the priest's gaze with eyes that held equal measures of shame and defiance. "Domingo," she said, "the carpenter, the slave." Father Calderon felt his legs weaken. He reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. "That's impossible. The access, the opportunity, the sheer." He couldn't finish the sentence, his mind rejecting the implications even as the evidence sat before him. "We didn't know about each other until last month," Adriana continued, her clinical tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this explanation. "Each of us believed we were alone in our situation. When Sophia's condition became obvious, she confessed to Mother. Then Isabella admitted the same. Then Mother revealed her own condition. And finally, when we compared timing and circumstances, we all identified the same man." The priest sank into a chair, his mind spinning. How did this happen? Under this roof, with servants everywhere, with your reputation." "He came to us separately," the mayor's interrupted, her voice hard now. "To repair furniture, to fix a broken lock, to install shelving. Always with legitimate reasons, always during times when we were alone in our chambers." He was persuasive. Father Calderon's theological training warred with his human understanding. The official position of the church was clear. Enslaved persons could not consent to anything, being property rather than persons with agency. Any sexual contact between an enslaved man and free woman constituted an assault on the woman, regardless of circumstances. But the mayor's tone carried something he couldn't quite identify. Not trauma, not fear, but something more complicated. "We must inform the viceroy immediately," he said. "This crime, no." The mayor's voice cracked like a whip. "Absolutely not. Do you understand what this would mean? Not just for us, but for every family in Lemur. If word reaches the viceroy, it becomes official. Official means records. Records means scandal. Scandal means our total destruction. Isabella's engagement will dissolve. Adriana's marriage prospects will vanish. Sophia's reputation will be irreparable. Our family name will become a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms across the empire. But you cannot hide this, Father Calderon protested. 4 pregnancies, 4 children. We're not hiding them, Adriana said. Quietly, we are controlling the narrative with your help. And so the conspiracy began, born not from evil, but from desperation, shaped by the crushing weight of social expectations and the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of colonial life. In that room, as morning light shifted across the floor and servants moved through their duties in distant parts of the mansion, 4 women and a priest began constructing a lie that would require the cooperation of dozens of people and the silence of an entire household. But first, they had to address the man who had caused this catastrophe. "Where is Domingo now?" Father Calderon asked. "Working in the carpentry shed," the mares answered. "He doesn't know we've discovered the pattern. He thinks each of us guards our secrets separately. What do you want done with him?" The question carried terrible weight. Under colonial law, an enslaved man who impregnated a free woman, particularly a woman of the mayor's status, faced execution. Not a quick death, but one designed for public display, a demonstration of society's power to enforce racial and class boundaries. The process typically involved torture, confession, public humiliation, and finally hanging or burning depending on local authorities' preference for spectacle. But execution would raise questions. Why was this slave killed? What crime did he commit? And those questions would lead to investigations that would uncover exactly what the family needed to hide. Sophia spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible. "Please don't hurt him." The other women turned to stare at her. Even Father Calderon looked shocked. "He must face justice," the priest began, but Sophia cut him off. "Justice? What justice exists in this world?" Her voice grew stronger, carrying an edge of hysteria. "He'll die because we exist, because the law says his existence threatens ours, because the truth of what happened between us cannot fit into any category the church or crown recognizes. But killing him doesn't undo our situation. It only adds one more death to the horror we've created." The mayor's hand moved as if to strike her youngest daughter, then stopped. Her face worked through a series of emotions, rage, grief, recognition before settling into grim resignation. "She's right," the mayor said finally. "His death solves nothing and risks everything. We need a different solution." Father Calderon knew he stood at a crossroads. His vows commanded him to report this to his superiors, to the civil authorities, to uphold the laws of God and empire. But his human compassion, his decades of hearing confessions and witnessing the gap between divine law and human reality, pulled him toward a darker path. "Complicity in concealment. What do you propose?" he asked, knowing that with these words he abandoned the firm ground of righteousness for the shifting sand of moral ambiguity. The mares leaned forward, her eyes hard as obsidian. "Domingo disappears, not dead. That creates martyrs and investigations. He simply vanishes, sold to a plantation in the north perhaps, or to a mining operation in the mountains somewhere. His voice cannot reach Lemur, where his testimony means nothing, because no one knows him or cares to verify his claims. And the children, 3 families," Adriana said, having clearly thought through this plan, "already distant cousins, loyal friends, people who owe us favors. Each takes 1 or 2 children, raises them in other cities. Mother's child goes to relatives in Arequipa, mine and Isabella's to different families in Cusco, Sophia's to trusted friends in Trujillo. The births happen quietly, the babies travel immediately, and within months our bodies return to normal. We resume our lives. The scandal dies before it fully ignites." "And the 4th child?" Father Calderon asked. "You said 3 families, but there are 4 pregnancies." Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating silence that carried the weight of a decision not yet spoken but already understood. "Some babies don't survive," the mayor said softly. "Complications during birth, Tragic certainly, but not uncommon. We mourn, we move forward. One lost child is simply unfortunate. 4 simultaneous pregnancies are a catastrophe that destroys everything. Father Calderon closed his eyes, knowing he had crossed beyond the realm of counsel into active conspiracy. "I'll need to speak with Domingo first," he said, to hear his confession to understand what motivated the situation. "No." The Marquise stood, drawing herself to her full height despite her condition. "You'll speak to him only to inform him of his fate. He has no voice in this matter. He never did. The moment he touched any of us, he forfeited any claim to justice, mercy, or consideration. Do you understand? This ends today, one way or another. Either he cooperates with his removal from Lemur, or we pursue more permanent solutions." The threat hung in the air, unambiguous. Just when we thought the morning's revelations couldn't become more disturbing, the implications of the mayor's cold calculation revealed the true depths of desperation that drove these women. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loved dark colonial history. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The confrontation with Domingo occurred that afternoon in the carpentry shed, a separate structure behind the main mansion, where he worked on furniture repairs and woodworking projects. Father Calderon approached alone, as the mayors had insisted. Fewer witnesses meant fewer potential complications. Later, the shed smelled of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil, familiar scents that contrasted sharply with the dark purpose of the priest's visit. Domingo stood at his workbench, planing a piece of mahogany, his movements precise and focused. He didn't look up when Father Calderon entered, though he must have heard the door open. "Domingo," the priest said, "we need to talk." The slave continued his work for several seconds before setting down his tool and turning to face the visitor. His expression revealed nothing. No guilt, no fear, no recognition of the catastrophe about to descend. "Father," he acknowledged, his tone neutral. "The women of this household are pregnant," Father Calderon stated bluntly, watching for reaction. "All 4 of them. They claim you are responsible." Domingo's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, calculation perhaps, or assessment of how to respond to an accusation that carried a death sentence. "They're lying," he said finally. "Why would they lie about this?" "Because they need someone to blame," Domingo answered, his voice low but steady. "Because the truth is worse than their fabrication." The priest felt ice spread through his chest. "What truth? You think I forced myself on 4 women in a household full of servants, with no one noticing, no one hearing, no evidence beyond their word?" Domingo's laugh carried bitter edge. "I'm property, Father. I have no rights, no voice, no defense, but I'm not stupid enough to commit suicide through rape. Whatever happened in this house, whatever secrets these women protect, they're using me as a convenient explanation that preserves their reputations while destroying mine." Father Calderon found himself unbalanced by this response. He'd expected confession, pleading, perhaps denial mixed with obvious guilt, but Domingo's calm logic planted seeds of doubt that had not existed before. "Then, what is the truth?" "The truth is that the mayor's has entertained male visitors in her private chambers for the past year," Domingo said. "The truth is that Isabella's Spanish fiancé visited months before the official engagement began. The truth is that Adriana has been meeting with Miguel Sandoval, the merchant's son, in the library when everyone thought she was reading alone. The truth is that Sofia has been conducting an affair with Pablo Herrera, the young man whose family owns the textile warehouse on Mercer Street. The truth is that all 4 of these women got pregnant by men of their own class, and now they need a scapegoat who can't defend himself." The accusations tumbled out with the ring of observed fact rather than desperate invention. Father Calderon's mind raced. Could it be true? The details were specific enough to verify Sandoval and Herrera were real people known in Lemur's social circles. The mayoress did receive visitors, though always with apparent propriety, But had there been more, why should I believe you? Why should you believe them? Domingo counted. 4 women, 4 separate occasions, all pregnant by the same enslaved man who somehow managed this feat without anyone noticing until now. It defies logic. It defies probability. It serves only one purpose: protecting the reputations of women who made choices they now regret and need to explain away. Father Calderon felt the ground shift beneath his certainties. If Domingo spoke truth, then the women weren't victims, but conspirators framing an innocent man. But if the women spoke truth, then this slave possessed both opportunity and audacity beyond anything the priest had encountered before. Both narratives seemed equally impossible yet undeniable. Regardless of truth, the priest said finally, "The decision has been made. You'll be sold and transported from Lemur. Your destination will be kept secret. You'll never speak of this situation to anyone under penalty of death. Do you understand? I understand that I'm being punished for crimes I didn't commit to protect people who did." Domingo replied, "I understand that truth means nothing when power decides otherwise. I understand that I'm property, not a person, and property has no right to justice. Will you accept this fate peacefully?" Domingo was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant as if calculating possibilities and finding them all equally futile. "What choice do I have?" he said finally. "If I resist, I die. If I speak out, I die. If I run, I die. The only path that offers even the possibility of survival is compliance. So yes, Father, I'll accept my fate peacefully, but the truth remains whether anyone believes it or not." That night, Domingo disappeared from the mansion. Senor Vargas supervised his departure, watching as 2 hired men, outsiders who knew nothing of the household's affairs, led him away in the darkness. The official story recorded in the household ledger stated, "Slave Domingo sold to northern buyer, 850 pesos received, transferred to Trujillo-based buyer for plantation work," but no name of buyer appeared in the records. No documentation of sales survived in Lima as official registries. No ship manifest listed a cargo of enslaved persons departing for the north in August 1803. Domingo simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, his presence in the world erased as thoroughly as if he'd never drawn breath. The household staff received clear instructions: speak nothing of recent events. Ask no questions. Make no speculations. Those who couldn't guarantee silence found themselves dismissed with small payments and vague references that would make finding new positions difficult. Within 2 weeks, 8 servants had been replaced, and the remaining staff understood perfectly what their continued employment required. Absolute enforced amnesia. The pregnancies continued through autumn and into winter. The mayors withdrew from social obligations, claiming illness. The daughters likewise retreated from Lemur's social calendar, their absence explained by various convenient excuses. Traveled to family estates, religious retreats, assistance to sick relatives in distant cities. In reality, all 4 women remained in the mansion, confined to private chambers on the 3rd floor, where few servants had access. A midwife from Callao, paid generously and threatened severely, attended them regularly, monitoring their conditions and preparing for the deliveries that would come in November and December. Father Calderon visited weekly, ostensibly for spiritual counsel, actually to ensure the conspiracy held together. He found the women's dispositions varied wildly. The mayors maintained iron control, treating her pregnancy as a logistical challenge to be managed with the same efficiency she'd always applied to household administration. Isabella swung between hysteria and numbness, spending hours staring out windows at the city she could no longer access. Adriana had withdrawn into herself, speaking only when necessary, her previous intellectual curiosity replaced by grim resignation. And Sophia talked to her unborn child, whispering conversations the priest could hear through closed doors, her voice carrying notes of tenderness and despair in equal measure. October brought troubling news from beyond the mansion walls. Miguel Sandoval, the merchant's son Domingo had named, had departed suddenly for Spain. His family claiming business obligations required his presence in Seville. Pablo Herrera, the textile warehouse owner's son, had likewise vanished from Lima, reportedly to manage family operations in Buenos Aires. These sudden departures could have been coincidence, but Father Calderon noted their timing with growing unease. Had the Mares made arrangements with these men? Had she warned them, threatened them, paid them to disappear before anyone could question them about potential connections to her daughters? The priest didn't ask, knowing that some knowledge carried more burden than enlightenment could justify. November arrived with unseasonable storms, rain hammering the mansion's tiles and flooding the streets. In the midst of the downpour on November 19th, the Mares went into labor. The midwife worked through the night while thunder shook the walls and lightning illuminated the third-floor chambers in stark flashes. At dawn, the household heard a baby's cry, brief, weak, then silent. The child didn't survive, the midwife reported to Father Calderon, born too early, lungs not developed enough. The Mares is recovering physically, but the loss has affected her severely. The priest performed last rites over the tiny body, noting the child's features as he did. Darker skin than expected for the Marquise's Castilian heritage, broader nose, thicker lips. The baby had been alive at birth, he was certain of it. The cry he'd heard had carried strength, but the midwife's face showed nothing except professional sympathy, and the small bundle she handed him for burial contained a cold infant who bore evidence of the very heritage that made its existence impossible to acknowledge. 2 days later, Isabella delivered a healthy boy. The child went immediately to the Sanchez family in Cusco, transported in the night by trusted servants who would never reveal their journey's purpose. 1 week after that, Adriana gave birth to a girl sent within hours to the Flores household in Arequipa. And finally, on December 8th, Sofia delivered twins, a boy and a girl, both robust and crying, both shipped separately to families whose names Father Calderon deliberately did not learn. By December 15th, the third-floor chambers stood empty again. The midwife departed with payment sufficient to purchase her permanent silence, and threats sufficient to ensure it. The servants who had witnessed any part of the deliveries found themselves generously compensated and immediately dismissed. Fresh staff, ignorant of recent events, filled the positions. The Mares Isabella and Adriana resumed their places in Lima's social world that spring, their figures restored, their reputations intact. Sofia, however, did not recover as expected. She remained in her chambers, refusing visitors, declining food, speaking to no one. Father Calderon recognized the signs of profound melancholy, what physicians called nervous collapse, and what we might now understand as severe postpartum depression compounded by trauma and grief. In March 1004, Sofia died. The official cause recorded in parish records stated consumption, the convenient diagnosis that covered multitude of conditions. Her funeral drew appropriate attendance from Lima's elite families, all expressing sympathy for the young woman cut down in her prime. None suspecting the weight of secrets she'd carried to her grave. The household settled into new rhythms, the scandal apparently avoided, the crisis apparently resolved. But Father Calderon noticed changes in the women who survived. The Mares, previously the embodiment of aristocratic confidence, now startled at unexpected sounds, and insisted on keeping lamps burning throughout the mansion at night. Isabella developed an obsessive fear of darkness, refusing to be alone in any room without abundant candlelight. And Adriana, the analytical daughter who had once questioned everything, now accepted the Church's teachings with desperate fervor, attending Mass daily, praying constantly as if sufficient devotion might somehow cleanse sins she couldn't name aloud. The fragile peace that descended on the Palacios Deeg household after Sophia's death proved temporary. In May 1804, a letter arrived from Cusco that would crack the carefully constructed facade the family had erected. Senora Vargas brought it directly to the mayors, recognizing the Sanchez family seal and understanding that correspondence from them could only concern one subject. The mayors opened it with trembling hands, her face paling as she read. When she finished, she sat motionless for several minutes before speaking. "The child is dead," she said flatly. "The boy we sent to the Sanchez family. Fever took him 2 weeks ago." Senora Vargas, the only servant who knew the full scope of the scandal, crossed herself. "God rest his soul, there's more." The mayor's voice carried an edge that made the housekeeper's stomach clench. Before he died, the child was examined by a physician. The doctor noted irregularities in the boy's appearance, features that didn't match the Sanchez family characteristics. Questions were raised. The family is concerned. They want assurances that no complications will arise from their charitable act. Translation: they wanted money to maintain silence. The child's death had created an opportunity for leverage that the Sanchez family, apparently less bound by honor than the mayors had believed, intended to exploit. This initiated a pattern that would define the next 3 years. The families housing the surviving children, the Flores household in Arequipa, the Ramirez family in Trujillo, each discovered that their charity could be monetized. Letters arrived quarterly, their tone progressively less sympathetic and more business-like. The children required education, clothing, medical care, all more expensive than anticipated. The families needed compensation for their ongoing discretion. The costs multiplied. The mayors paid, of course, she had no choice. But the constant drain on the family's finances could not continue indefinitely without notice. Her steward, Tomas Ibarra, a meticulous man who had managed the estate's accounts for 2 decades, began asking questions about the unusual pattern of expenditures to families in distant cities. The mayors deflected with vague explanations about charitable obligations and family debts, but Ibarra's skepticism grew. In November 1805, Ibarra approached Father Calderon with concerns that the mayors might be falling victim to fraud or extortion. The priest's attempts to reassure him that all expenses were legitimate only deepened the steward's suspicions. A man of numbers and patterns, Ibarra recognized that legitimate charitable work didn't follow the specific rhythm he observed in the ledgers. Quarterly payments always in the same amounts to the same families with no corresponding requests or acknowledgement of receipt. Someone is blackmailing the family. Ibarra concluded the question is why. What secret is worth this much gold? Father Calderon suggested the steward discuss his concerns directly with the mayors, knowing this would force her to either bring Ibarra into the conspiracy or find another steward less curious about financial irregularities. The mayors chose inclusion, revealing enough of the situation to justify the payments while omitting the full scope of the scandal. "I made mistakes," she told Ibarra in her private office, her voice carrying uncharacteristic vulnerability. "There was a man, a brief affair of which I'm deeply ashamed. A child resulted. The families you've identified are caring for that child, and I pay them to ensure the secret remains buried. It was technically truth, just not the whole truth." Ibarra accepted this explanation with the diplomatic grace of a man whose position required pretending to believe his employer's necessary fictions. He asked no further questions, made no judgments, and continued managing the finances with the understanding that certain expenditures required no documentation beyond his private coded records. But the incident left the mayors shaken. How many other observant servants or business associates might notice patterns, ask questions, connect dots that led back to that catastrophic period in 1803? The scandal she'd buried required constant vigilance to keep underground, and each year brought new risks of exposure. In March 1806, another blow struck. A packet arrived from Arequipa containing a letter and a sketch. The Flores family housing Adriana's daughter had commissioned a portrait of the child for their family collection. The artist, demonstrating unfortunate skill, had captured the 3-year-old girl's features with precise detail, including the noticeably darker complexion, the distinctive bone structure, the physical characteristics that marked her heritage as something other than pure Spanish aristocracy. "People are starting to notice," the letter stated. "Our neighbors comment on how little the child resembles our family. Our priest expressed concern that we might be housing the illegitimate offspring of servants or slaves, suggesting this compromises our standing in the church. We require additional compensation to address these social difficulties, or we may need to reconsider our arrangement." More money changed hands, more letters followed. The Ramirez family in Trujillo reported similar concerns. The children, now approaching 4 years old, showed characteristics that invited speculation, questions, rumors. The families had taken them on with the understanding that they were distant relations fallen on hard times, but maintaining that fiction grew increasingly difficult as the children's appearances diverged from family norms. Adriana, who had maintained rigid emotional control since the deliveries, began showing cracks in her composure. She attended Mass obsessively, spending hours in prayer, wearing a hair shirt beneath her dresses until her skin bled. Father Calderon recognized the signs of someone seeking punishment, attempting to atone through physical suffering for sins of the spirit. "I dream about her," Adriana confessed during one particularly anguished session. "My daughter. I never held her, never saw her face before they took her away. But in dreams, I see her perfectly. She has my eyes, and I abandoned her to strangers because her existence threatened my comfort." "You made the choice necessary for survival," the priest offered, though his own certainty about that judgment had eroded over the years. "Survival isn't virtue," Adriana replied. "We survived by sacrificing others. The man we exiled for crimes he may not have committed. The children we scattered like inconvenient cargo. Sophia, who couldn't live with what we'd done. How many more must die to preserve our lie?" Before Father Calderon could respond, urgent knocking interrupted them. Senora Vargas stood in the doorway, her face stricken. "Father, you need to come immediately. Isabella has received a visitor from Cusco." They found Isabella in the formal salon, facing a young man in travel-stained clothes, whose features immediately explained Senora Vargas' alarm. He appeared to be in his early 20s, well-dressed despite the journey's dust, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. His skin tone fell somewhere between European and indigenous, his features a striking blend that suggested mixed heritage. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, bowing slightly to the gathered women. "My name is Carlos Mendizábal. I believe you knew my father, Domingo, who worked in this household several years ago." The world seemed to tilt. Father Calderon gripped the doorframe to steady himself. How was this possible? Domingo had been sold and transported years ago, his fate deliberately obscured. Yet here stood someone claiming to be his son, speaking with education and bearing that suggested resources far beyond what an enslaved person could have provided. "We didn't know Domingo had a son," the Mars said carefully, her politician's instincts taking over despite her shock. "When did you last see your father?" "I haven't," Carlos replied. "He disappeared when I was 16, sold away by his previous owners. I've spent years tracing his movements, following the trail of sales and transfers, trying to locate him or at least learn his fate. The trail led me here to the Palacios Diger mansion, where records show he worked from 1797 to 1803. I was hoping you might know what became of him." Isabella's face had gone paper white. Adriana gripped the back of a chair with both hands. The mayor's expression revealed nothing. Years of aristocratic training allowing her to maintain composure even as the ground crumbled beneath her. "I'm afraid your father was sold to a plantation in the north. the Marquise said smoothly. The exact location escapes my memory. It was several years ago, and we've had many workers in that time. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. I see. Carlos studied her face with unsettling intensity. It's strange, though. I've checked the shipping records in Callao, the plantation registers in Trujillo and Chicleo, even the mining operations in the mountains. No record exists of a slave named Domingo arriving anywhere in 1803. It's as if he simply vanished, which is difficult to accomplish with property that required documentation for every transaction. The implicit accusation hung in the air. Father Calderon stepped forward, using his clerical authority to defuse the situation. Records from that period can be unreliable, he said. Wars, administrative chaos, simple bureaucratic incompetence. Many transactions went undocumented. Your father may well be alive and working somewhere under a different name, as sometimes happened when slaves were sold multiple times. Perhaps Carlos's tone suggested he didn't believe this explanation. I wonder, though, if I might speak with servants who worked here during that period. They might remember details that could help me. I'm afraid most of our staff from that era no longer work here, the Mares replied. Household composition changes frequently. The few who remain likely didn't interact much with your father. He worked primarily in the carpentry shed, somewhat separate from the main house. Carlos nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I appreciate your time. If any information surfaces about my father's whereabouts, I'd be grateful if you'd send word to me. He provided an address in Lima where he could be reached, then departed with the same unsettling courtesy he displayed upon arrival. After he left, the three women and priest stood in silence, each processing the implications of this unexpected intrusion into their carefully buried past. Finally, Adriana spoke, her voice hollow. He knows something. The way he looked at us. Questions he asked. He suspects more than he's saying. We tell him nothing, the Marquise said firmly. He has no proof, no leverage, no authority. He's the son of a slave trying to make trouble for people far above his station. We ignore him, and he'll eventually give up and move on. But Father Calderon wasn't convinced. Carlos Mendizábal had demonstrated resources, education, and determination unusual for someone of his background. His investigation had already uncovered the absence of documentation that should have existed, the administrative void where Domingo's trail should have continued. How long before he started connecting other dots? How long before he learned about the pregnancies, the secret births, the children scattered across Peru? That night, Father Calderon couldn't sleep. He sat in his small rectory office, reviewing the past 4 years, tallying casualties of the conspiracy he'd helped construct. Sophia, dead from grief and despair. 4 children, now 3 surviving, raised by strangers bearing the weight of secrets they didn't yet understand. Domingo disappeared into a void that Carlos's investigation threatened to illuminate, and women themselves transformed from the confident aristocrats he'd once known into haunted figures maintained by willpower and fear. The knock on his door came at midnight. Senora Vargas stood outside, her face pale in the lamplight. Father, you need to come. Something terrible has happened at the mansion. It's Isabella, she's confessed. She's told Carlos everything. The scene in the blue room was chaos, barely contained. Isabella sat in the same chair her mother had occupied 4 years earlier, her face blotchy from crying, her hands twisted in her lap. Carlos Mendizábal stood near the window, his expression shifting between shock and something darker. Vindication, perhaps, or cold satisfaction at having his suspicions confirmed. The Mares paced like a caged animal, her usual composure shattered. Adriana huddled in a corner, staring at nothing, her fingers working through rosary beads with mechanical precision. And Father Calderon, entering this nightmare scene, felt the weight of every compromise and concealment he'd enabled, settling on his shoulders like physical burden. Tell me she's lying, the Mares demanded of Carlos, though the request made no logical sense. Tell me you put ideas in her head, manipulated her into some elaborate fiction. I said nothing. Carlos interrupted, his voice cutting through her desperation. I came to thank her for her time yesterday, to bid farewell before returning to Cusco. She answered the door herself, took one look at me, and broke down. The words poured out like she'd been holding them back for years. 4 women, 1 slave, secret pregnancies, children scattered across Peru. A conspiracy that destroyed multiple lives to preserve reputations built on lies. You have no proof, the mayor's hissed. Her word alone proves nothing. I have more than her word. Carlos reached into his jacket and withdrew papers, unfolding them carefully. I told you I'd been investigating my father's disappearance. What I didn't mention was how thorough that investigation became. I have testimony from servants you dismissed in 1803, paid to forget what they'd witnessed. I have letters between you and the families housing your grandchildren, negotiated through intermediaries who kept copies for insurance. I have medical records from the midwife in Callao who documented 4 births between November and December 1803. All to women of the same household, all children immediately transferred to undisclosed locations. The blood drained from the mayor's face. That's impossible. We were careful. You were desperate. Carlos corrected. Desperate people make mistakes. They trust the wrong servants, pay off the wrong witnesses, assume silence can't be purchased when sometimes people keep records as protection. The midwife, for instance, kept detailed notes about every birth she attended, including yours. When she died 2 years ago, her daughter found the records and, finding them strange, showed them to a lawyer who happens to be my associate. Father Calderon felt his legs weaken. The entire conspiracy, the years of careful concealment, had been unraveling behind their backs while they remained ignorant of the threads being pulled. What do you want? He asked, knowing the answer would be terrible. Justice, Carlos said simply, for my father who was exiled or killed to cover your crimes, for the children you abandoned, for the truth you've buried. I want the full story documented, admitted, made public so that everyone knows what the noble Palacios Dieger family did to protect their precious reputation. That's revenge, not justice, Adriana said quietly from her corner, speaking for the first time. You want to destroy us the way we destroyed your father. Can you blame me? Carlos's voice carried raw pain beneath the surface anger. You took my father from me. You've taken children from their mothers. You've built your lives on a foundation of suffering and silence. Someone needs to tell the truth. The truth will hurt more than just us, the Marquise said, rallying her diplomatic skills despite her panic. The children you claim to care about, exposing this scandal brands them permanently as products of sin, marks them as illegitimate offspring of a slave and aristocrats. They'll face discrimination, rejection, legal complications regarding inheritance and status. Your quest for justice condemns them to social death. Carlos hesitated, the first crack appearing in his determined facade. The mayor's pressed her advantage. Think carefully about what public revelation accomplishes, she continued. It doesn't bring your father back. It doesn't undo what happened. It only spreads the pain wider, destroying innocent children who bear no responsibility for adult choices. If you genuinely care about justice rather than revenge, you'll consider the full consequences of exposure. Then what do you propose? Carlos challenged. More silence, more lies, everyone pretending this never happened while you continue your comfortable lives. I propose acknowledgement, Adriana said, rising from her corner with unexpected strength in her voice. Private acknowledgement, documented truth kept sealed, but preserved so the children can someday know their origins without being destroyed by public revelation. Compensation for you for time lost searching for your father, for the injustice you've suffered, and answers. Tell us what you need to know and we'll answer honestly. No more lies, at least among ourselves. The proposal hung in the air, a compromise that satisfied neither justice nor concealment completely, but offered a middle path that might preserve both truth and the people caught in its destruction. Father Calderon recognized the wisdom in Adriana's words, though he wondered if Carlos possessed sufficient mercy to accept less than full public vindication. I want to know what really happened, Carlos said. Finally, not the version crafted to protect reputations, but the truth. Did my father force himself on you, or were you complicit? Was he a monster or a scapegoat? The women exchanged glances, long-waited looks that carried years of shared secrets and divergent experiences. Finally, the mare spoke, her voice stripped of its usual authority, sounding almost human in its weariness. "I don't know what truth means anymore," she admitted. "Did your father initiate contact?" "Yes." "Was it forced?" That word becomes complicated when discussing interactions between a slave and a free woman. The law says he could never gain consent because his status made any sexual contact with me a crime by definition. But the law also says I couldn't consent to him because his slavery meant he lacked the personhood required for legitimate intimate relations. We exist in categories that make honest discussion of what happened nearly impossible. "Try," Carlos demanded. "He was kind," Isabella said softly, tears streaming down her face. "When I was alone in my chambers, afraid of the marriage being arranged for me, terrified of leaving Lima for a strange country and a strange man, your father came to repair a broken escort in my room. We talked, just talked at first. He listened in ways no one else did. He saw me as a person, not as a political alliance or social commodity. And over time, that kindness became something else. The same for me," Adriana added. "He treated me as if my thoughts mattered, my opinions had value. In a world where women exist to be beautiful and obedient, your father spoke to me as an equal. I knew it was forbidden, knew the risks, but I was tired of being a decorative object in my mother's household. I wanted to be seen as human, even if only by a man the world called property. Sophia had written about it in a journal discovered after her death," Father Calderon remembered. "She'd described Domingo as the only person who makes me feel real, not like a doll arranged for others' purposes." The priest had burned those pages, knowing they could never be acknowledged publicly, but he remembered their anguished honesty. The mare's confession came last and hardest. "I was lonely," she said. The words seemingly pulled from her throat against her will. "My husband died, leaving me responsible for an estate, a social position, daughters whose futures depended on my ability to maintain our status. Everyone wanted something from me, decisions, permissions, judgments. Your father asked for nothing. He came to fix a door lock in my study, and we talked about inconsequential things. It was relief. A brief moment of being just a woman, not a mare or mother or widow. And yes, it became more. By the time I recognized what was happening, the boundaries had already blurred beyond recovery." Carlos listened to these confessions with an expression that cycled through emotions. Anger, grief, confusion, recognition. "He never forced you," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You were all complicit. And when the consequences became undeniable, you saved yourselves by sacrificing him." "Yes." Adriana answered when no one else spoke. "We sacrificed your father to preserve our positions. We told ourselves we had no choice, that society's rules gave us no alternative, that his life mattered less than our reputations. We were wrong. We made choices, and those choices destroyed people who deserved better, but knowing we were wrong doesn't undo what we did." "Where is he?" Carlos demanded. "If you didn't sell him north, where did he go? Is he alive?" The question hung in silence, heavy as lead. Father Calderon looked to the mares, who looked to Isabella, who looked at Adriana. The truth they'd all avoided articulating, even among themselves, could no longer be dodged. "We don't know." The mares finally admitted. "He was taken away in the night. 2 men hired through intermediaries tasked with removing him from Lima. We were told he'd be transported to a remote location where his testimony could never reach authorities, but we deliberately knew no details. What we didn't know, we couldn't reveal under pressure or by accident. So, he could be dead," Carlos said flatly. "He could be," Father Calderon confirmed, feeling the weight of potential murder settle on his conscience. Alongside the other sins he'd accumulated, the men hired for that work. Their discretion often comes through permanent solutions. We told ourselves he'd been relocated because believing otherwise meant acknowledging we might be complicit in something worse than exile. Murderers, Carlos breathed, looking at each of them in turn. All of you, maybe not by your own hands, but by your orders, your money, your willingness to look away while others did violence you couldn't stomach directly. No one argued with this assessment. The truth of it silenced any defense they might have mounted. I want their names, Carlos said, the men who took my father, and I want to see those children, the ones who survived. They deserve to know the truth about their parentage, even if the world never does. This is where the compromise was struck. In that room on a humid lemur night in March 1806, between people who had all been damaged by the same conspiracy in different ways, Carlos would receive names of the men who had transported Domingo along with funds to investigate his father's ultimate fate. He would be introduced to the surviving children, allowed to establish relationships with his half-siblings, given the truth about their shared parentage. In exchange, he would keep the scandal private, understanding that public revelation would harm the children more than anyone else. Father Calderon drafted documents recording the true events of 1803 and their aftermath to be sealed and held in the church's archives, accessible only to direct descendants after the death of all primary participants. It was acknowledgement without public confession, truth preserved but hidden, a solution that satisfied no one completely, but protected the most vulnerable parties. Carlos departed the next morning with the names Tomasara had uncovered through his own discreet investigation of the household's suspicious expenditures 4 years earlier. The two men hired to transport Domingo, hired muscle from Lima, as port district, known for handling difficult removals, were found and interviewed. Their story, when sufficient gold loosened their memories, proved as terrible as feared. Carlos Mendesabel returned to the mansion 3 weeks later, his face haggard, his eyes carrying knowledge that had cost him something essential. Father Calderon met him at the door, seeing in the young man's expression confirmation of the worst possibilities they'd all entertained, but never fully articulated. I found them, Carlos said without preamble, the men who took my father. They remembered the job clearly. It's not often they're hired to disappear someone permanently from a household like this. The priest led him to the study where the mayors, Isabella and Adriana, waited with the tense anticipation of prisoners awaiting sentence. Carlos refused the offered chair, standing instead with rigid control that suggested any relaxation would shatter what remained of his composure. My father didn't make it out of Lima, he stated. The men took him by boat into the bay under darkness. They were instructed that he could never return, never speak of his time here, never exist in any official capacity that might allow him to testify about events in this household. The easiest way to guarantee that outcome was to ensure he never reached any destination at all. Isabella made a small wounded sound. Adriana closed her eyes. The mare sat perfectly still, her face carved from stone. They weighted his body and dropped him into deep water. Carlos continued, his voice mechanical, reporting facts as if emotion might destroy his ability to speak at all. He was alive when they put him overboard, conscious. He didn't struggle, they said. Didn't fight or plead, just watched them as the water took him under. Like he'd known all along this was how it would end. They'd done this work before, but my father's acceptance of his fate disturbed even them. Usually, people fight to live, they said. My father seemed almost relieved when the water closed over his head. The silence that followed this revelation felt like suffocation. Father Calderon found he couldn't draw a full breath, as if his body rejected air that must be shared with people capable of orchestrating such horror. "You're murderers," Carlos said, looking at each woman in turn. "Not indirectly, not through negligent delegation, but directly. You ordered his death, you paid for it. You deliberately chose not to know details so you could maintain plausible denial. But that ignorance was itself a choice. You killed my father because his existence threatened your comfort." "We didn't order murder," the mayor protested, her voice cracking. "We ordered removal, transportation, relocation. You ordered his eraser from existence. Carlos interrupted savagely. You hired men known for making problems disappear. You provided no instructions on keeping him alive, no concerns about his welfare, no interest in where he ended up as long as it wasn't Lemur. You created the conditions that made murder the simplest solution, then claimed innocence because you didn't explicitly tell them to kill him. That's cowardice, not innocence. Adriana stood suddenly, walked to the window, and vomited into a decorative urn. The sound of her retching provided horrible punctuation to Carlos's accusations. When she finished, she remained bent over the urn, dry heaving, her body rejecting the truth it had swallowed. "What do you want from us?" Isabella asked, her voice small. "We can't bring him back. We can't undo what we did. We can't even properly atone because acknowledging our guilt publicly would destroy the children we were trying to protect. So what do you want? Our lives, our reputations, our souls if we haven't already forfeited them?" "I want you to live with it," Carlos said, his anger crystallizing into something colder and more deliberate. "I want you to wake every morning knowing you murdered an innocent man to preserve your social status. I want you to see his face in mirrors, in shadows, in quiet moments when your carefully constructed lies stopped drowning out truth. I want you to remember that somewhere under Lemur's Bay, weighted down by rocks and chains, my father's bones rest in darkness because you valued your reputations more than his life." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll keep my word about the children. They'll never know the full horror of their origins. I'll tell them their father died during transport, which is technically true. They'll believe he was a good man caught in unfortunate circumstances, which is also true. But understand this, I'm not protecting you with my silence. I'm protecting them from the knowledge that they exist because of a conspiracy that ended in murder. You get to live with the complete truth while they live with a gentler version. That's not mercy, that's ensuring the weight of this sin rests on the people who actually bear responsibility for it." After Carlos left, the three women and the priest sat in silence that stretched into hours. Servants knocked occasionally, asking about meals or appointments, and were sent away. The sun tracked across the sky, illuminating, then abandoning the study, leaving them in gathering dusk. Finally, as full darkness settled, Adriana spoke. "I'm leaving tomorrow. There's a convent in Cusco that accepts women seeking permanent refuge from the world. I'll take vows, dedicate my remaining years to prayer and penance. It won't redeem what I've done, but at least I'll stop pretending I deserve the life I've been living." "That's escape, not atonement," the mayor said, though her voice lacked its usual force. Perhaps Adriana agreed. "But I can't continue existing in this house, in this city, among people who see me as something I'm not. Every social gathering, every polite conversation, every moment of normally feels like dancing on my father's, on Domingo's grave. I need to stop dancing." Isabella said nothing, but her expression suggested she understood her sister's impulse, even if she lacked the courage to follow it. The mayor stared at her hands, perhaps seeing blood that wouldn't wash away regardless of how many years passed. Father Calderon, watching these women confront the full weight of their actions, felt the collapse of his own moral framework. He'd entered the priesthood believing in redemption, in the power of confession and penance to restore souls damaged by sin. But this situation exceeded the boundaries of traditional theology. How did one atone for murder disguised as pragmatism? How did one confess sins committed through delegation and willful ignorance? How did one grant absolution when the victims couldn't forgive because they'd been silenced permanently? The documents he'd prepared, sealed and locked in the church archives, represented his own failure as much as the women's guilt. He'd helped them bury truth under layers of justification and compromise, telling himself he was protecting innocent children, when really he was protecting his own inability to confront evil when it wore the face of desperation rather than malice. The years that followed Carlos's revelation reshaped the lives of everyone touched by the scandal. though most of Lemur never knew the truth that had fractured behind closed doors. Adriana left for the convent as promised, taking only a small bag of personal items and a substantial donation that ensured her acceptance despite her lack of genuine calling. She wrote occasionally to her family brief letters describing life among the sisters, but the words felt hollow, written by someone whose spirit had already departed, even though her body persisted. She died in 1811 officially of pneumonia, though Father Calderon suspected she'd simply stopped fighting to live. Isabella never recovered her previous social grace. She attended necessary functions, maintained appearances, but something had broken inside her that couldn't be repaired. She developed a nervous habit of checking door locks obsessively, as if securing physical barriers might protect against memories that needed no doors to invade. She never married, despite several proposals from men who saw her family name and fortune without perceiving the damaged woman beneath. She lived until 1815, dying in her sleep, though servants who discovered her body remarked that her face held an expression of profound relief, as if death had finally released her from a prison she'd inhabited for years. The Marquise survived longest, maintaining control of the household until her death in 1819 at age 58. She never spoke of the events again after Carlos's departure, conducting her life as if that entire period had been excised from time. But those who knew her well noted changes. She donated substantial sums to organizations working to abolish slavery, supported hospitals treating the poor, funded schools for children regardless of their parentage. She never explained these philanthropic impulses, but they suggested conscience expressing itself through the only redemption she could imagine, using her wealth to address evil she'd participated in creating. Carlos Mendizábal established relationships with his half-siblings, visiting them regularly without revealing the full circumstances of their connection. He introduced himself as a family friend, a benefactor interested in their welfare. The children growing into adolescence and young adulthood welcomed his attention without suspecting the deeper bonds that connected them. The girl living with the Flores family in Arequipa showed remarkable intelligence, eventually marrying a lawyer and raising children of her own, never knowing her biological mother lived and died in a convent haunted by memories of the daughter she'd abandoned. The boy with the Ramirez household in Trujillo apprenticed to a merchant, learning trade skills that eventually made him moderately wealthy, unaware that his real father's bones rested under Lemur's Bay, silenced to protect secrets he'd never learn. The twin boy and girl that Sophia had delivered both survived to adulthood, raised by a family who treated them with genuine affection, despite the mysterious circumstances of their arrival. They grew up believing their mother had died in childbirth, which was technically true. Sophia had died, just not in the physical act of delivery, but in the spiritual destruction that followed. They occasionally received visits from a sad-faced man who brought gifts and asked about their lives with intensity that seemed excessive for a family friend, never understanding that Carlos saw in them the ghost of a young woman who'd paid the highest price for scandal she'd helped create. Couldn't survive. Father Calderon maintained his position in Lemur until 1817, when declining health forced his arm.